Imagine sitting at the head of a huge boardroom table. You are looking at a spreadsheet and it says one of your divisions just generated $2 billion.
Right, in a single quarter.
Exactly. Not a year, a quarter. And you are growing that specific business unit at nearly 10% year over year. So you take a breath, you open the floor to the most powerful financial analysts on Wall Street, and the very first person to key the microphone politely suggests that your $2 billion, 10% growth engine is, well, actually a massive disappointment.
Yeah, welcome to the hyper-growth expectations of modern medical technology.
It's wild, but that is the exact dynamic we are dissecting today in this deep dive.
It is a totally ruthless environment, you know. Astronomical success is basically treated as a baseline. And any slight deviation from absolute perfection, I mean, they treat it like a structural failure. You are essentially punished for the scale of your own previous innovations.
Which is exactly why we are looking at the Q2 2026 earnings conference call transcript for Abbott Laboratories today, ticker symbol ABT.
Right, because our mission here is to really decode how a massive global conglomerate balances this sprawling portfolio. I mean, they sell everything from baby formula and generic blood pressure medication to next generation heart devices and colon cancer screening kits.
Right. How do they balance all of that to consistently drive growth? And maybe more importantly for you, the retail investor, how do they fend off a Wall Street culture that is literally always looking for the first sign of blood in the water?
Because to understand Abbott's second quarter, you really have to analyze the psychology and the strategic positioning of their CEO, Robert Ford.
He was on fire.
He was. He spent this entire earnings call putting on a masterclass in defending a really complex narrative against some incredibly pointed skepticism from the analysts.
So before we look at how he defended the fortress, let's lay out the bricks. You need the baseline headline numbers to anchor this conversation.
Right, the data Ford approach.
Exactly. So in Q2 of 2026, Abbott achieved a 4.8% comparable sales growth, which, by the way, actually represents an acceleration from their previous 2 quarters.
Yeah, that's not a slowing train.
No. And they posted an adjusted earnings per share of $1.31, beating analyst expectations. On top of that, they expanded their gross margin by a full 100 basis points, bringing it up to 58%.
Which is huge in this climate.
It is. And finally, they raised their full-year earnings guidance to a range of $5.45 to $5.60.
Those numbers represent an incredibly heavy lift with today's macroeconomic headwinds. But, you know, the top-line revenue isn't the real story here.
No.
No, the story is the underlying mechanics of how they pulled it off. And really, whether the foundational demand for healthcare is as stable as Abbott claims it is.
Which brings us to the first major conflict of the transcript. Because there is this palpable anxiety floating around Wall Street right now regarding the overall health of the hospital system.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So Robert Marcus, an analyst from JP Morgan, gets on the call and he points a spotlight directly at a series of negative pre-announcements from hospital operators.
Right. The hospitals were waving a red flag.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he essentially asks Ford if the ongoing Medicaid disenrollments, you know, the millions of people losing coverage due to challenges with the Affordable Care Act, if that is causing a sudden deceleration in medical procedures across the country.
And from an investor standpoint, you know, that is a perfectly logical equation to draw.
Right.
If millions of Americans are being stripped of government-funded health insurance, the immediate assumption is that those people will stop going to the hospital for elective or semi-elective procedures.
Makes total sense on paper. Less insurance coverage across the population should equal fewer devices sold by Abbott.
Right. But Ford completely attacks the very premise of that equation. He calls it a flawed assumption. And he brings up this historical counterpoint that fundamentally shifts how you have to look at the medtech sector.
What was the counterpoint?
He tells the analysts to literally look back at the original implementation of the Affordable Care Act, right? Back when Medicaid was vastly expanded, millions gained coverage almost overnight.
Oh, right.
And the pharmaceutical companies saw a massive, immediate spike in new patients getting prescriptions. But medical devices, medtech, saw almost zero artificial boom from that expansion.
Wow. So the logic there is incredibly tight. If the medical device industry didn't experience a massive artificial surge when millions of people suddenly acquired Medicaid, There is no mathematical reason to model a massive contraction when enrollment shrinks.
Exactly. The correlation between Medicaid enrollment and high acuity medical device usage simply does not exist in the data.
But the natural follow-up for you as an investor is, well, why doesn't that correlation exist? I mean, if I suddenly get health insurance, why wouldn't I finally go get that medical procedure I've been putting off?
It comes down to the demographics and the severity of the diseases Abbott targets. Ford lays out two distinct drivers, isolating them from this macro anxiety.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, Medicaid is simply not the primary economic engine for surgical procedures in the United States. Medicare is.
Right, Medicare.
Yeah, Medicare covers the aging population, people 65 and older. Ford noted on the call that Medicare represents over 2/3 of Abbott's entire U.S. cardiovascular business.
2/3? That's massive.
So Medicaid disenrollment is absolutely a political and social issue, but economically, it barely touches Abbott's core demographic.
It's the difference between a 30-year-old losing coverage and a 70-year-old requiring a heart valve.
Precisely. Which leads directly into Ford's second point, which is inelastic demand.
Right, inelastic demand.
The U.S. healthcare system is incredibly complex and, deeply flawed in many ways. But it does not turn away dying patients based on insurance status when they show up at an emergency room.
Yeah, they have to treat you.
And Abbott makes products for serious, acute, major chronic conditions. We are talking about heart failure, advanced diabetes, late-stage cardiovascular disease.
Those are definitely not discretionary procedures. A patient doesn't look at their Medicaid status and decide to postpone a massive heart attack until the next fiscal year.
Exactly. The demand for these interventions is structurally hardwired into human biology and the aging process.
Let's strip away the Wall Street jargon for a second. It's like an automotive analyst worrying that a sudden drop in premium car wash subscriptions is going to crater the sales of airbags.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Right. Airbags are critical, inelastic, and their sales volume is driven entirely by the sheer number of cars on the road and the inevitability of accidents. It has absolutely nothing to do with discretionary spending on the aesthetics of the car.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. Pacemakers and ablation catheters are basically the airbags of the human body. They're driven by an aging population, not discretionary Medicaid spending.
But Ford doesn't rely on analogies, right? He leverages proprietary data to prove it.
Yeah, he introduces this concept of Abbott's internal forward-looking radar.
I love that phrase, forward-looking radar.
It's brilliant. Abbott operates a massive diagnostic core laboratory business. They manufacture the massive, highly automated machines that sit inside hospital basements, analyzing thousands of blood and tissue samples a day.
So they see everything.
Right. Because roughly 70% of all medical decisions made by doctors rely on a diagnostic test, Abbott doesn't need to guess about procedure volumes.
They don't have to wait for the hospitals to report.
Exactly. They can look at the utilization rates of their own machines and know in real time exactly what global healthcare demand looks like before the hospitals even post their earnings.
And when you look at their actual core lab numbers from the transcript, it completely destroys the entire Medicaid slowdown thesis. Their U.S. core lab business didn't shrink. It grew 7.5%.
Wow.
And the specific hospital lab segment within that, up 13%.
They aren't seeing a macroeconomic slowdown at all.
Not even a little bit. They are tracking a massive acceleration driven by the inescapable demographic reality that 10,000 Americans turn 65 every single day.
10,000 a day. That is a structural demographic tailwind that will completely overpower any temporary fluctuations in Medicaid enrollment.
So, since we've established that the demand for these life-saving procedures is structurally secure, let's look at the actual hardware they are putting into these aging patients.
Right. Let's talk devices.
We need to talk about Abbott's cardiovascular device portfolio, which grew an impressive 8.5%. But the real standout is the electrophysiology segment, EP for short.
Yeah, EP posted low teens growth.
Low teens, that's huge for hardware.
It is. And electrophysiology is currently the most fiercely contested battleground in medical technology. It focuses on diagnosing and treating cardiac arrhythmias.
Like atrial fibrillation.
Exactly, AFib.
Yeah.
Where the heart beats irregularly, which significantly increases the risk of stroke. And the technological catalyst driving Abbott's explosive growth here is a transition to a technology called PFA, or pulsed field ablation.
Right, PFA.
Abbott recently launched their Volt 2.0 PFA catheter in the U.S., alongside the Tactiflex Duo internationally.
Ford mentioned on the call that the international rollout of these tools is gaining such intense traction that it drove 20% growth in Europe alone.
20% growth in Europe is staggering for a mature device market.
But the transcript just throws the acronym PFA around. We need to explain the mechanics of this because it completely changes the surgical landscape.
Yeah, let's translate that.
Traditional cardiac ablation uses thermal energy, right? The surgeon threads a catheter into the heart and either burns the misfiring tissue with extreme heat or freezes it with extreme cold.
Right, and that creates a scar that blocks the irregular electrical signals. That has been the gold standard for decades.
But there's a huge problem with thermal energy.
Yeah, the problem with thermal energy is that it spreads. When you burn tissue inside the thin wall of the heart, that heat can accidentally damage surrounding structures.
Like the esophagus.
Exactly, the esophagus, which sits directly behind the heart. Esophageal damage is a catastrophic, potentially fatal complication.
And PFA fixes this.
PFA eliminates that thermal risk entirely. Pulsed field ablation uses microsecond bursts of high-voltage electrical fields to basically punch microscopic holes in the cell membranes of the heart tissue.
It's called electroporation, right?
Yes. It essentially short-circuits the specific cells causing the arrhythmia, but leaves the surrounding tissue completely untouched.
Wait, how does it know which tissue to target?
Because different types of cells have different thresholds for electrical fields. Myocardial cells, the heart muscle cells, are highly susceptible to PFA, but esophageal and nerve tissue, they are highly resistant.
So it's basically tissue selective?
Precisely. It allows the physician to instantly neutralize the target tissue without any collateral thermal damage. It is faster, it is infinitely safer, and the clinical outcomes are spectacular.
Which perfectly explains why Ford emphasizes that this technology is moving procedures out of traditional hospital operating rooms and into ambulatory surgery centers, or ASCs.
Right.
Because if you remove the risk of burning a hole in the patient's esophagus, you don't need to put them under heavy general anesthesia anymore.
You can just perform the ablation using conscious sedation. The patient is awake but relaxed. They don't need a dedicated anesthesiologist managing an airway, and they could literally go home hours later instead of recovering in an ICU.
That fundamentally rewrites the economics of the procedure for the hospital, while vastly improving the experience for the patient.
It does. But Ford also highlighted a critical detail about Abbott's specific Volt 2.0 system on the call.
Which was?
Seamless integration. When an electrophysiologist is inside a beating heart, they rely on complex 3D mapping software to visualize the electrical pathways.
Okay, like a GPS for the heart.
Exactly. And if a new PFA catheter doesn't communicate flawlessly with the hospital's existing mapping system, the physician is essentially flying blind. Abbott engineered the Volt to integrate perfectly with the leading mapping systems, removing all friction for the surgeon.
That is a massive competitive advantage. But if EP is their technological triumph, the structural heart division is their glaring vulnerability right now.
Yeah, this is the tense part of the call.
Very tense. This is where TD Cowen analyst Josh Jennings steps in and essentially holds management's feet to the fire. He asks Ford point blank when this massive foundational unit is going to recover its footing in the U.S. market.
And Ford's response is a fascinating study in corporate transparency. I mean, it is incredibly rare for a CEO of a publicly traded company to avoid corporate speak and just flat out admit a failure.
He didn't blame anyone else.
No, he doesn't blame the macro environment. He doesn't blame the FDA. He flat out admits that in the highly competitive U.S. mitral valve space, Abbott is suffering from a commercial execution issue.
He basically tells Wall Street that Abbott objectively possesses the broadest portfolio of structural heart tools on the market, but their U.S. sales force simply hasn't figured out how to sell the entire toolbox to hospital purchasing departments.
Right. They have the best gear, but they are getting outmaneuvered by competitors with smaller portfolios, but much sharper sales pitches.
He contrasts that U.S. struggle immediately with their international performance too, just to prove it's not a hardware problem.
Yeah, internationally, their transcatheter aortic valve replacement, or TAVR revenue, is up 30%.
30%. So the international teams are taking massive market share. The devices work beautifully. The clinical data is strong. The failure is entirely localized to the U.S. commercial strategy.
It really is.
But let me ask you this. If a CEO openly admits on a recorded earnings call that one of their most critical U.S. divisions is failing purely because the sales team can't execute the pitch, how long does Wall Street actually tolerate that before they start demanding executive heads on pikes?
Well, you can't just say, my bad, when billions of dollars in market share are bleeding out to competitors. Wall Street's patience is measured in weeks, not years.
So Ford is on the clock.
Ford knows the clock is ticking loudly. He mentioned they have already implemented leadership changes and are actively restructuring their market approach.
He explicitly set an expectation that investors will begin to see a turnaround in Q4.
Yeah, he bought himself exactly 2 quarters of runway.
Just 2 quarters.
And to pacify the analysts in the meantime, he pivoted hard to the upcoming pipeline. He mentioned the Sophia mitral valve entering pivotal trials and the AMALYT 360, which is a left atrial appendage closure device, which is anticipating FDA approval shortly.
So he is playing a very delicate game of acknowledging current incompetence while promising future dominance.
Exactly.
But, if they are admitting a commercial execution failure in the physical architecture of the heart, it raises a massive question about how they manage the chemical architecture of the blood.
Yes.
Let's move from cardiovascular hardware to continuous glucose monitoring, or CGM. This is Abbott's absolute crown jewel, the Libre ecosystem.
And this is where we return to your opening scenario, the $2 billion quarter.
Right. Larry Beagleson from Wells Fargo points out that the Libre system grew at 9.5%, and he frames this as a potential slowing point.
Which is just wild.
It is. The business generated $2 billion in 90 days. It grew nearly 10%, and a major analyst suggests the engine might be stalling.
Ford handles it playfully on the call, defending his massive business. But he is forced to acknowledge the reality of how these highly penetrated markets eventually plateau.
The underlying tension here is the total addressable market, or the TAM. Ford lays out the macro math for the analysts. Globally, there are roughly 75 to 80 million individuals who require intensive insulin therapy or have advanced diabetes that would clinically benefit from wearing a continuous glucose monitor.
Okay, 80 million people need it.
Yet today, across all manufacturers, only 15 million people are using one.
So there are over 60 million people walking around right now who desperately need this technology to manage their disease, but don't have access to it.
And it's not a lack of supply, it's a massive structural bottleneck. So what is keeping 60 million patients away from a simple wearable sensor?
It is entirely dictated by the agonizingly slow gears of global reimbursement policy.
Insurance and governments.
Exactly. The clinical argument is over. The data is indisputable. When a patient uses a CGM, their A1C levels, which measure their long-term average blood sugar, they plummet.
They get way healthier.
They spend vastly more time in a safe glycemic range. Their risk of diabetic ketoacidosis drops, and their rate of emergency room hospitalizations falls off a cliff.
But those 60 million remaining patients cannot afford the out-of-pocket cost of replacing sensors every 2 weeks.
No, they need their government or their private insurer to unlock the funding.
Ford specifically points to massive potential catalysts, like U.S. Medicare expanding coverage for type 2 diabetics who don't even use insulin yet, or massive European markets expanding baseline coverage.
But projecting the growth of the Libre franchise requires projecting the bureaucratic behavior of governments.
Good luck with that.
Right. As Ford notes, once the French government or U.S. Medicare signs the authorization, predicting patient adoption is relatively straightforward. But forecasting the exact month or quarter a massive government entity will finalize a budget approval, it's impossible.
So between those massive market-making reimbursement events, growth naturally consolidates into the high single digits as the current covered population reaches saturation.
That's the plateau they are experiencing. But they aren't just managing the plateau, they are fundamentally expanding what the sensor can actually do.
This was the really cool part of the call. They just secured a CE mark in Europe for the LibreDuo.
Yeah, this isn't just a minor iteration. It's the world's first dual glucose and ketone monitor combined into a single wearable sensor.
That is a massive clinical leap. Monitoring glucose tells a patient if their blood sugar is too high or too low.
But monitoring ketones tells a patient if their body has stopped using sugar entirely and is instead burning fat at a dangerous rate, producing acid in the blood.
Which leads to diabetic ketoacidosis.
Yes, which is fatal if untreated. Combining both sensors means the device isn't just managing a chronic condition, it's actively predicting and preventing acute fatal medical emergencies.
While the dual sensor tech is amazing, the most aggressive move Abbott made in this quarter wasn't clinical, it was industrial.
Oh, the factory.
Yes. Ford casually mentions that Abbott is already in the final stages of planning a 5th dedicated manufacturing facility for the Libre platform. That is a $1 billion capital expenditure.
The scale of that investment completely contradicts the narrative of a slowing market.
It's a breathtaking display of confidence. I mean, Building a billion-dollar factory while analysts are grilling you about 9.5% growth. It's like a city building a massive state-of-the-art sports stadium while they're still waiting for the state legislature to approve the highway funds to let fans drive there.
That's exactly what it's like.
Abbott is so fundamentally certain that those 60 million uncovered patients are eventually going to receive reimbursement, that they are deploying $1 billion in capital today just to ensure they have the physical capacity to meet the tsunami of demand when the floodgates finally open.
You do not spend $1 billion on a factory if you believe your core product has permanently plateaued.
No way. It is the ultimate expression of trusting internal long-term demographic data over short-term Wall Street anxiety. They are absorbing the skepticism today because their models guarantee the demand tomorrow.
Which provides the perfect pivot to our next battlefield on the call.
Let's do it.
We move from monitoring chronic disease in the blood to the highly contested race to detect acute disease before it spreads. Let's talk about the cancer screening war, specifically Abbott's integration of Exact Sciences.
This represents a massive strategic pillar in their diagnostics portfolio, and the transcript indicates the integration is flawless so far. The Cancer Diagnostics Division posted a massive 13% growth rate, driven almost entirely by mid-teens growth in the utilization of Cologuard.
Right, and for context, Cologuard is the non-invasive stool-based screening test for colorectal cancer that patients use at home.
The one in the commercials.
Yes, but the really fascinating part of the transcript was the mechanical explanation of how Abbott drives that specific growth in the back half of the year.
Yeah, Ford details a strategy built around care gap programs. This is where corporate healthcare metrics directly dictate patient care.
Care gap programs are essentially massive compliance engines run by large health systems and insurance providers. Hospitals are graded on the quality of care they provide using standardized metrics.
Things like CD's credits and Medicare star ratings.
Exactly. And a massive component of a hospital's overall score is the percentage of their eligible patient population that has been actively screened for cancer.
And if they miss those percentage targets, they lose massive amounts of funding and bonus payouts.
Millions of dollars. So in the second half of the calendar year, hospital administrators look at their internal dashboards and realize they are falling behind on their colon cancer screening targets.
Panic mode.
Right. To close that gap before the December 31st deadline, they initiate aggressive care gap programs. They heavily push Cologuard to thousands of non-compliant patients because it doesn't require scheduling and invasive colonoscopy.
It creates a massive, highly predictable surge in Abbott's screening volume every single autumn. Furthermore, Ford highlighted the extreme stickiness of the product.
Stickiness.
Yeah. Once a patient is entered into the Cologuard funnel, when they're due for their routine rescreening 3 years later, the compliance rates are exceptionally high.
To get them into the system. But, the stool test is facing an existential threat.
Right, the blood test. Vijay Kumar from Evercore brings this up. He asks about a highly anticipated data release from a competitor named Freenome.
Yeah, Freenome is developing a blood test for colon cancer, and their V2 data showed an 18% detection rate for advanced adenomas, which are the precancerous polyps.
And let's be honest, a blood draw at your annual physical is infinitely more convenient than dealing with a stool sample at home and shipping it through the mail.
It absolutely is. But Ford's defense of the stool test against the impending wave of blood-based diagnostics requires really understanding the molecular biology of cancer detection.
He didn't shy away from it.
No, he openly acknowledges the convenience of a blood draw, but he ruthlessly targets its clinical Achilles heel, which is sensitivity.
Let's break down the science of why that matters. Looking for early-stage colon cancer in a stool sample is like finding DNA evidence physically left at the scene of the crime, right?
Yes, exactly.
Polyps grow in the lining of the colon, and as stool passes by, it physically scrapes against the polyp, causing it to shed its mutated DNA directly into the sample. The concentration of the target biomarker is extremely high.
Right. Conversely, a blood test is looking for circulating tumor DNA, or ctDNA. For a blood test to work, the polyp in the colon has to shed its mutated DNA into the bloodstream.
Which is much harder to find.
Finding those microscopic fragments of ctDNA diluted in gallons of blood circulating through the entire human body is like trying to find a single suspect's fingerprint floating down a raging river.
Wow.
By the time a tumor is shedding enough DNA into the blood to be reliably detected, it is often at a much more advanced, dangerous stage. Stool tests detect the precancerous adenomas years before a blood test ever could.
So Abbott's clinical argument is incredibly sound. But their corporate strategy is much more, well, Machiavellian.
How so?
Ford's strategy isn't to defeat the blood test. His strategy is to monopolize both modalities. Abbott is actively developing their own blood test alongside Cologuard.
Ford understands that clinical superiority doesn't always defeat consumer convenience. There is a massive cohort of patients who will absolutely refuse to interact with the stool sample, regardless of its statistical sensitivity.
Right. By offering a proprietary blood test, Abbott captures that highly resistant consumer and brings them into the Abbott ecosystem.
And once they are in the database, Abbott intends to use ongoing education to eventually graduate that patient up to the gold standard Cologuard test.
Wait, I have to challenge this corporate funnel strategy logic.
Go for it.
I'm putting myself in the shoes of a stubborn patient. If I choose a blood test purely because I am utterly repulsed by the idea of a stool sample, there is zero chance a corporate email campaign or a doctor's pamphlet is going to talk me into taking a stool test 3 years later.
You're probably right.
Human behavior is notoriously rigid when it comes to medical friction. Is Abbott actually delusional about consumer behavior here? Or is this graduation funnel just a convenient narrative to cover up the fact that they are terrified of being disrupted by a simple blood draw?
It is almost certainly a strategic hedge wrapped in optimistic corporate messaging.
It sounds good on an earnings call.
Exactly. Abbott's internal data scientists are well aware of behavioral rigidity. If the broader market decides that the convenience of a simple blood draw outweighs the risk of lower clinical sensitivity, the entire landscape of early detection will shift overnight.
So they have to have a blood test.
They do. Abbott's funnel narrative sounds proactive to investors, but the reality is totally defensive. They're developing the blood test because if they don't own the gatekeeper mechanism for the most stubborn consumers, a competitor will. They are ensuring they capture the revenue stream regardless of which physical fluid the patient decides to provide.
That makes a lot of sense. But whether they are analyzing blood or stool, building out high-tech cancer screening infrastructure, funding a billion-dollar CGM factory, or developing pulsed field ablation catheters, it requires a staggering amount of capital.
Staggering.
Where does a company generating tens of billions of dollars find the foundational cash to fund these futuristic, high-risk bets?
It comes from the least glamorous, most vital parts of their portfolio.
Nutrition and established pharmaceuticals.
Yes, these are the heavy cast iron engines in the basement of the company that ensure the ship never stops moving. Let's look at nutrition. Abbott posted a $125 million sequential growth in this division.
That represents a massive operational rebound. In the pediatric nutrition sector, their international business flipped back to positive growth at 6.5%.
And domestically.
Domestically, the U.S. team clawed their way out of massive industry supply chain disruptions to completely reclaim their position as the undisputed market leader in securing WIC contracts.
Which are the massive government programs that feed low-income infants.
Right. As well as non-WIC retail dominance.
And moving to adult nutrition, which is anchored by massive legacy brands like Ensure, the data shows that consumers have fully absorbed the aggressive price hikes Abbott instituted late last year.
Yeah, Ford explicitly noted that retail consumption of Ensure in the U.S. is up double digits year over year.
But they aren't just relying on price hikes. They are actively reformulating their legacy products to capitalize on the biggest pharmaceutical trend of the decade.
GLP-1 weight loss drugs.
Exactly. With millions of Americans taking drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy, human eating habits are fundamentally changing. Abbott is aggressively launching high-protein, low-sugar products, including a new collagen protein shake and a shake heavily fortified with creatine and HMB.
That pivot is driven by hard clinical science, too. The mechanism of GLP-1 drugs suppresses appetite so severely that patients often fail to consume enough basic nutrients.
Right, they just don't want to eat.
And more importantly, clinical data shows that GLP-1 users don't just lose adipose fat tissue, they suffer from rapid sarcopenia.
Which is a massive loss of lean muscle mass.
By flooding the market with high-protein, creatine-fortified shakes, Abbott is positioning their legacy nutrition brand as a mandatory clinical companion to the weight loss drugs, actively treating the muscle-wasting side effects.
It's a brilliant synergy. And then there is the established pharmaceuticals division, or EPD. We cannot skip over this.
No, we can't. It grew 9% across India, Latin America, and Southeast Asia.
EPD is arguably the most beautiful, reliable financial engine inside Abbott. It does not chase high-risk patents or cutting-edge biological engineering.
No, it sells high-quality, off-patent, branded generic medicines in emerging global markets.
Its growth isn't driven by risky FDA approvals. It is driven by undeniable macroeconomic megatrends.
As the middle class expands across India and Latin America, and as their populations age, the demand for reliable, affordable treatments for chronic conditions like hypertension, gastroenterology, and early-stage diabetes just explodes.
It is the ultimate barbell strategy of corporate finance.
The barbell strategy.
Yeah, on one extreme end of the barbell, you have incredibly sexy, high-risk, hyper-innovative technologies. Pulse field ablation catheters, punching microscopic holes in heart tissue, dual glucose ketone sensors, and stool-based DNA cancer detection.
Right, the stuff that makes headlines.
Exactly. But on the other end of the barbell, you have reliable adult nutrition shakes and generic blood pressure pills being sold by the millions in Southeast Asia. One end of the barbell funds the other.
If the high-tech division hits an unexpected clinical roadblock or a massive regulatory delay, the protein shakes and the generic pills hold the line, ensuring the cash never stops flowing.
And that exact barbell strategy is how Robert Ford answers the most sweeping existential question of the entire earnings call.
Travis Steed's question.
Right. Travis Steed, an analyst, asks Ford to look past the current quarter and map out the mathematical blueprint for Abbott looking ahead to 2027.
And Ford doesn't offer vague platitudes. He lays down what we can call the 7% rule.
He makes a remarkably bold claim to Wall Street. He asserts there are very few $30 billion plus healthcare conglomerates on Earth capable of growing their top-line revenue by 7% consistently, year after year.
But he maps out the exact formula of how Abbott achieves it.
He breaks down the required contributions from every segment of the barbell. He expects the massive, steady nutrition business to grow at 2 to 4%.
Diagnostics, once they adjust for some specific geopolitical headwinds in China, will reliably grow at 7 to 8%.
The established pharmaceuticals business in emerging markets will churn out 7 to 9% growth.
And the medtech division, the high innovation arm fighting the catheter and CGM wars, is targeted to grow at 8 to 10%.
When you blend all of those highly diversified, non-correlated divisions into a single corporate entity, the math dictates an incredibly resilient 7% top-line growth.
And because Abbott possesses such immense operational scale, that 7% revenue growth leverages into double-digit earnings per share growth for the investors. It is basically an algorithmic approach to dominating healthcare.
And Ford concludes by reminding the analysts that this formula isn't just executive optimism drawn on a whiteboard. The execution is visible in the current quarter's tape.
Yeah, their gross margin expansion strategies are objectively working. They physically expanded margins by a full 100 basis points in a highly inflationary environment.
Their free cash generation is running ahead of internal forecasts, granting them massive flexibility for future capital deployments.
Like the billion-dollar factory.
Exactly. And they have engineered a steady, rhythmic cadence of new product launches scheduled over the next 12 to 24 months across every single division to ensure the growth engines never starve for new inventory.
Talk about a bottom line. We have to call this a heavily bullish signal. We've unpacked the mechanics of a highly diversified healthcare giant today. Abbott is utilizing a brilliant barbell strategy, leveraging steady, cash-generating legacy products to fund high-growth, high-tech innovations.
They're actively ignoring the macroeconomic panic surrounding Medicaid disenrollments and hospital volumes, choosing instead to trust their own proprietary diagnostic data.
And they are making billion-dollar manufacturing bets on their pipeline, confident that demographic reality will always eventually overcome bureaucratic bottlenecks.
They are a conglomerate that deeply understands the dichotomy of their existence. Wall Street analysts will perpetually demand flawless perfection and hypergrowth in every 90-day window.
But the reality of global healthcare requires immense patience, staggering capital investment, and an unwavering structural focus on the long-term demographic trends of the human species.
That's the real takeaway here.
Which leaves you, the listener, with one final provocative thought to consider. Think back to the beginning of this deep dive when we discussed Abbott's diagnostic core lab machines.
Oh, the forward-looking radar.
Exactly. Those massive automated systems are currently scattered across thousands of hospital basements all over the globe, constantly analyzing human blood, tissue, and fluids. They are processing millions of data points every single day.
Abbott essentially possesses a real-time global surveillance system of human biology.
They know exactly how many people are getting sick, what specific diseases are trending in which specific zip codes, and precisely how actively the medical system is treating them across the entire planet.
We live in a financial world that is absolutely obsessed with unpredictable, constantly revised, and heavily politicized economic indicators.
We panic over monthly jobs reports, consumer sentiment surveys, and inflation data.
But considering the scale of their operation, is it possible that a medtech company like Abbott holds the single most accurate, unfalsifiable macroeconomic indicator of all?
The real-time molecular metric of human health.
It really forces a reevaluation of how you measure the economy. The next time Wall Street panics over a murky, speculative economic forecast regarding consumer spending, perhaps they should stop staring at heavily manipulated spreadsheets and start looking at the diagnostic X-ray of society that Abbott is holding in their hands.
Because unlike the muddy, unpredictable waters of financial forecasting and discretionary spending, human health, the unstoppable aging of the global population, and the rising tide of chronic disease is the one structural reality that humanity simply cannot disenroll from.